Welcome back to Jack of Some Trades. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this farm-style side table with a viewing panel. This side table will be going in the living room, so I want it to match the coffee table that I built previously. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend checking it out. I also had built some bedside tables for the bedroom, so I wanted to incorporate some of that design as well. I came up with this design, where I'll use the glass viewing panel element of the coffee table, as well as the farm-style cross bracing of the bedside tables. And then I'll stain the whole thing the same color as the coffee table. For this design, I needed 3 8-foot 2x2s, 1 8-foot 2x4, and 1 2-foot by 4-foot by 3/4 inch thick sheet of plywood. In total, the wood cost me about $35. Overall dimensions of the table are simple. I made it 22 inches by 22 inches by 22 inches, which is the perfect size to fit next to the couch. You can change the dimensions however you want, but building a cube is a little less complex because there are fewer different dimensions to worry about. I start by cutting the 2x4 to size, which will make up the border for the top surface, which houses the glass viewing panel. As most of you already know, a standard 2x4 is actually 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches, and I wanted this part to be 3 inches wide, so I cut 1/4 inch off each side on the table saw. Next, I took the 2x4, which is now more of a 2x3, to the miter saw to cut the 22-inch lengths. Miter the ends at a 45 in order to make up the border for the top panel. I check each one after I cut them to make sure they're exactly the same length as each other. If they're off even just a little bit, it'll end up not being quite square when gluing it together. I cut the legs of the table to 19 inches out of the 2x2s, so that when the 3-inch wide tabletop is placed on, in total, it'll be 22 inches tall. Again, I double check to make sure they're all exactly the same length, so that the table will stand flat on the ground and not rock back and forth. Then I cut the 2x2s for the border of the lower shelf. Coincidentally, they're actually the same length as my table legs at 19 inches, in order to fit in between the legs on either end. Keep in mind a standard 2x2 is actually 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. Next, I cut the 3/4 inch wide by 3/8 inch deep dado in the mitered pieces for the plywood sheet to fit into. This plywood will be the surface below the glass to put decorations on. Then, I cut the 1/4 inch wide by 3/8 inch deep rabbet on the edge of the same pieces to create the groove that the glass panel will fit into. After that, I cut the plywood into 2 pieces. One that's 19 3/4 inches by 19 3/4 inches for the top, and the other that's 19 inches by 19 inches for the bottom shelf. The top piece had to be slightly wider to fit into the dado grooves that we just cut. Then I sand each piece on my upside down handheld belt sander that I clamped into the workbench. You might have seen this hack in my previous videos. I use it all the time, since this is actually my only belt sander. I use light pressure on the wood since it's very soft, and pressing down too hard could take off too much material too quickly and ruin the pieces. Next, I glue together the top of the table. I apply glue to either end of each piece, as well as inside the dado, where the plywood will insert. I used a ratchet strap as a clamp, which works really well when gluing together mitered frames. It applies constant pressure on all corners and surfaces, so everything stays square. I had to insert a thin piece of scrap wood to protect the sides from getting dinged by the hooks and lever. Now back to the lower shelf. I drilled 2 pocket holes on each edge of the plywood. The plywood is 3/4 inches thick, so I used 1 1/4 inch screws and set my jig for 3/4 inch wood. Then I attached the 2x2s that I cut earlier to the edges of the plywood. I clamped the 2x2 to the table saw so it won't move, and apply the glue to the edge of the plywood. I joined the two together by fastening the pocket hole screws. The table saw is actually a great surface for glue ups. It's large and very flat. Just make sure you clean up all the glue afterwards. I drill pocket holes into the bottom of the 2x2s so the shelf can be attached to the legs. I set my jig for 1 1/2 inch wood and used 2-inch screws, although you should technically use 2 1/2 inch screws for this thickness. I just didn't happen to have any of those laying around, so I used what I had. I drill more pocket holes in the end of each leg, which will be used to secure them to the top section. I just followed the same method that I used in the previous step. One perk of using pocket hole screws is that once the screws are in, there's no clamping needed. Next, I give the shelf a quick sand to get rid of any rough edges or markings that came on the wood. I just sanded this part by hand because of how soft the wood was. So I got a little bit ahead of myself and started cutting the cross braces for the sides before I actually put it together. I based the angles and dimensions off of this drawing, but these are just theoretical dimensions, which could be slightly different after assembling the table. Luckily for me, these ended up working out just fine, but they were a little loose in some areas. So just a quick tip, if you want these to fit perfectly, do them after you put together the rest of the table. Next, I start assembling the table. I start out by marking 4 1/2 inches up on each leg, which is how high I want my lower shelf, for this reason. Just look at him go. Then, I clamp the leg into the workbench, add some glue, match the line I drew with the shelf, and drive the pocket hole screws. I do this for each leg until all 4 of them are attached to the shelf. Before I attach the top, I go over it with a belt sander. It's easier to do this step now before it's attached to the rest of the table. I go over it with a random orbital sander, paying extra attention to the corners where the legs will be attached to make sure they're flat. Then I attach the legs to the top. First, I add glue to the corners and then flip the legs onto the top. My power drill wouldn't fit into this gap, so I used a socket wrench and a little bit of elbow grease to drive the pocket hole screws. I just made sure the legs stayed flush with the corners while fastening. Before I attach the cross bracing, I gave each piece of sand on the belt sander just to get rid of any of the splinters or marking that's on the wood. Again, I used a really light pressure to avoid taking off too much material. Then, I glue the cross bracing into the sides of the table. I apply glue to the lap joint and at the ends of each piece. They fit pretty snug for the most part and required minimal clamping. Now time to stain. I gave it the same stain that I gave my coffee table, classic gray, just so they matched. My first coat was very light, so I gave it a second coat to darken it up a bit, to match the coffee table a little bit better. Finally, I finish it off with 2 coats of semi-gloss polyurethane to protect the wood from moisture and scratches. To finish off the build, I ordered glass online, and I poured some decorative beach glass into the coffee table. Then I placed a panel on top. Now I have to say, it matches the coffee table really well. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out my other DIY projects, and subscribe for future projects.